the first study I did was based on a sample in Chicago, and we found that if a kid was assessed, given an assessment of cognitive skills, think of an IQ test, verbal, language, reading ability, problem-solving skills. If a child, by pure chance, was given that assessment just after a homicide had occurred down the street, when compared to the kid given the same assessment just before it, looked like that child exposed to that incident of violence had missed about 2 years of schooling. So their performance regressed by about 2 years. The impact was so strong, I thought it was probably wrong. We all know that violence is harmful. There was no intervention that could have that big of an impact. So we thought it was probably wrong. So I replicated it in a second data set, different sample, and the impact was stronger the second time we did it.
Presenting the acclaimed new book, Uneasy Peace. William Julius Wilson is the Louis P. and Linda L. Geiser University Professor at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy of the Kennedy School of Government. He's also the author of a number of books, including There Goes the Neighborhood, Racial, Ethnic, and Class Tensions in Four Chicago Neighborhoods and Their Meaning for America, More Than Just Race, Being Black and Poor in the Inner City, and The Truly Disadvantaged, The Inner City, the Underclass, and Public Policy. Patrick Sharkey is professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at New York University. He's published research examining how aspects of the neighborhood environment influence the choices that adolescents make as they navigate potentially violent streets, and on the relationship between long-term neighborhood disadvantage and individual cognitive development, violent behavior, and victimization. He's also the scientific director of Crime Lab New York, an independent organization dedicated to applying and evaluating new methods for addressing crime, violence, and poverty. Uneasy Peace explores the reasons behind the dramatic decline of violent crime in the last 20 years and the far-ranging effects it has on urban neighborhoods. A starred Kirkus review called it a rich, complex book that makes splendid use of the data to trace the recent renaissance of city neighborhoods and how children and the poor flourish in a time of relative peace. And the Wall Street Journal described it as insightful and engaging and an excellent introduction to America's up-and-down urban violence roller coaster ride, which offers an antidote to those who think that the police are more the problem than the solution. Please join me in welcoming William Julius Wilson and Patrick Sharkey.
Thanks for that introduction. Thanks for coming out. This is fun. I grew up not far away and came to this bookstore quite a bit. I wasn't nervous at all, and then I saw Mike Massano and Jeff Shea and Kevin Sharkey and Brendan Sharkey come in the room. A lot of people that I grew up with are here, so all of a sudden the stakes got higher here. But I'm really excited to be here, and I'm particularly grateful for William Julius Wilson being here. We've had the chance to be on the same panels a few times, and I always say the same thing. Professor Wilson is the reason I became a sociologist. It's not an exaggeration. So the book that was not mentioned was The Truly Disadvantaged. That was published in 1987, and I read it a little bit later when I was in college. I was assigned to me in a course on probably on public policy, and I read that book and I said, I think that's what I want to do. I want to see if I can do what he did in that book. And it's actually relevant for tonight, for this book. So what Professor Wilson did in The Truly Disadvantaged is he was the first person. I'm going to try to make this a book talk about somebody else's book. Then we'll get to mine afterward. But what he did is he was the first person to observe that something had changed in cities. The nature of urban poverty had changed, and a lot of people had seen what was going on. Cities seemed like they were out of control in the 70s and the 80s, and it seemed like something different. Well, Professor Wilson documented what it was. He documented how the manufacturing jobs that had brought African Americans up out of the rural South into the cities of the Northeast, Midwest, and later the West, how they started to go away. And when they went away, how family structure started to deteriorate. That model of having a sole breadwinner that had really been the model in central cities for every racial and ethnic group, that started to fade away as a sustainable model, and families started to change. At the same time, middle-class families, African-American middle-class families started to take advantage of new civil rights and started moving out of the traditional black ghetto and into new parts of the city, into the suburbs. And so what was left behind were areas where poverty was concentrated, okay? The poor and the middle class used to live together in the same communities in the central cities. That was no longer true, and what was left behind was areas that were concentrated, where there were fewer and fewer jobs, where family structure had changed to a large degree, and where a whole range of social problems started to emerge, including violence, okay? So that book, he put all these forces together, and he explained what was going on in central cities. And I read that book, and I said, first off, I want to go work with him and learn from him, and then secondly, I want to see if I can make it in that same field and try to do something along the lines of what he did in that book. And so the first part of my career, I looked at how growing up in disadvantaged environments, how this affects families, how it's passed down across generations of families, and what role this played in perpetuating racial inequality in the U.S. But I continued to run into this puzzle, which is what was actually going on, what was most important, what was happening in those neighborhoods that affected kids' academic achievement, their cognitive development, their economic opportunities, and later their wealth and income later in life. And that was the motive. We're finally getting to the book. So that was the motivation for this book. I wanted to figure out what was actually happening in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods that seemed to have such a big impact on kids. And my starting point was to think about violence as a possibility. There were a whole bunch of hints pointing in that direction. There's some great ethnography done in the 1990s. Elijah Anderson wrote a book called Code of the Street. There Are No Children Here was a more popular book. A lot of people probably read that one. And so that was all pushing me in that direction. But then I did a set of studies almost 10 years ago where basically the evidence base suggesting that violence is one of the most important features of neighborhood poverty, or one of the truly damaging features of neighborhood poverty. There was a lot of good ethnography. There wasn't very good quantitative evidence. There wasn't really convincing evidence that suggested that this is a hugely important factor. So what I tried to do was focus in on specific, tangible ways to see if there is an impact of violence. So for instance, one of the first studies we did was to look at kids who were taking assessments of cognitive skills or academic skills and comparing the scores of kids who were assessed just before and just after major incidents of violence had taken place near their home. Okay, and so the idea was if we can see an impact there, then it's a pretty good bet that it's causal, that it's something about that incident that affected the kids. And the first study I did was based on a sample in Chicago, and we found that if a kid was assessed, given an assessment of cognitive skills, think of an IQ test, verbal, language, reading ability, problem-solving skills. If a child, by pure chance, was given that assessment just after a homicide had occurred down the street, when compared to the kid given the same assessment just before it looked like that child exposed to that incident of violence had missed about 2 years of schooling. So their performance regressed by about 2 years. The impact was so strong, I thought it was probably wrong. We all know that violence is harmful. There was no intervention that could have that big of an impact. So we thought it was probably wrong. So I replicated it in a second data set, different sample, and the impact was stronger the second time we did it. So I started to think maybe there's something here, and that put me on a trajectory for investigating how much violence plays a role in the consequences of growing up in very disadvantaged environments. And each study that's been done, several by me and then several others that have been published by other researchers with a similar approach, looking at the timing of when violence hits and how that affects kids, has told the same story. Violence is more destructive than anyone realized. We found impacts on not just on kids' performance in school, but on their ability to maintain their attention as they're taking an assessment, their ability to control their impulses, their sleep, their stress levels. Okay, one of the studies that I talk about in the book is, if you remember the Beltway sniper shootings in 2002, okay, that occurred around the D.C. area, and that whole region of the country was kind of paralyzed by fear. Well, there's this great study that looks at kids who were going to school nearby the site of one of the shootings. Okay, so these were completely random shootings, and there was no rhyme or reason to the victims or the location. So these researchers looked at kids who went to school nearby one of the shootings and then compared them to kids who went to identical schools, looked entirely similar, but went to school further away, several miles away, okay? And what they found was that the kids who went to school nearby the shootings, their academic performance dropped that year, okay? And it was a sustained drop. It sustained throughout the year. And this finding keeps coming up, that, you know, we all know how damaging violence is, but we now have very good evidence that it's more destructive than anyone realized, okay? And it's not that violence makes children less intelligent, it's that it occupies their minds, okay? Children carry the burden of violence with them as they enter the classroom. And it's not limited to kids, okay? Violence, one of the arguments I make in the book is that violence undermines entire communities. Violence makes it less likely that a teacher will invest in a neighborhood. My brother Kevin taught in one of the most violent neighborhoods of Chicago. I don't think the violence was the reason he stopped teaching there, but it makes for a stressful environment. It makes it less likely that a teacher will commit to a school district. It makes it less likely that a family will invest in a neighborhood, buy a home in a neighborhood. It makes it less likely that business owners will invest in a community. And then it changes the daily experience. It makes it less likely that residents will venture out into public spaces, into parks, into bookstores, and into libraries. So violence, I have come to think of violence as the fundamental problem of American cities, the idea being that nothing else works when public spaces are unsafe. Okay, when you think about city life prioritizes public space over private space. It prioritizes people coming together and sharing space. Well, when those spaces are unsafe, then city life fades away. It no longer works, okay? So at some point when I was doing this research on the impact of violence, I had this realization that the problem was actually getting much better. Better meaning violence was becoming less severe. So while I was carrying out all this research, you know, when I actually started reflecting a little bit, I had this realization, okay, violence was plummeting all over the country. So if violence is as important as I'm arguing, then we should see some change. We should see some shifts in the nature of city life and the nature of urban inequality. And that's what this book is about, okay? So the book starts with this argument that violence is more destructive than we imagine, than anyone realized. Even the people who are in violent environments, who are teaching kids in violent environments, the damage that is done and the burden that kids carry with them is not visible. You know, it affects their cognitive functioning, affects every aspect of their lives. But then the second piece, violence has fallen, and it's fallen on a tremendous scale. So let me give you a sense of that scale. Since the early 1990s, when violence started to fall, to now, the national homicide rate has fallen by almost half. The rate of all violent crimes has fallen by a similar amount, almost half. Now, a lot of people are distrustful of statistics reported by police departments up to the FBI. And so I just want to emphasize that there are other sources of data that tell the same story, okay? So there's it's called the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a survey of Americans, and asks them, over the past 6 months, have you been assaulted, robbed, beaten? And so the official statistics say that violence has fallen by roughly half. The surveys of the American population suggest that the fall has been even more stark, that violence has fallen by 75% or more. Okay, so every source of data tells the same story. Violence has plummeted over the past 25 years, and the greatest impact has been on cities. So, you know, almost every city across the country has experienced some drop in violence. You wouldn't know that by the dialogue on urban violence, but that's the empirical reality. Almost every city. There are a few anomalies. Baltimore now has a level of violence that was similar to what it had in the early 1990s. Newark, you know, right near 30 miles away from New York City. New York City's homicide rate went from 35 to about 3.5 per 100,000 people, 35 homicides per 100,000 to about 3.5 now. Newark's is still right around 30, 35, okay? So there are anomalies, but the point is they are anomalies, okay? We've seen this incredible change in the nature of city life that's gone on over the past 25 years, where we had a period from the 70s to the 90s where city life was associated with violence. And for good reason. Most cities were intensely violent places. Most big cities in the country had homicide rates that are typically seen only in the most violent nations of the world, war-torn nations of the world. That's still true for a small number, but those are the anomalies at this point. Okay, there's been a fundamental change in the nature of city life. And one of the things that's not visible, so we can kind of, everyone in the room is aware of how urban spaces have changed, at least from the look and feel of those spaces. So I live near Washington Square Park in Manhattan, and the feel of that park has completely changed over time. What I think most people in this room are probably less aware of is the changes that have gone in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. What we've found when we've looked at actually neighborhood level changes in crime, the greatest changes in violence, the greatest drops in violence have occurred in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods across the country, and the greatest beneficiaries have been the most disadvantaged segments of the population. Okay, what do I mean? The easiest way to make this point is to talk about lives preserved. Okay, and so the drop in the homicide rate has saved tens of thousands of lives. It's increased life expectancy of black men, we estimate, by about 3/4 of a year. And so that, that number may not seem all that stunning. People are often underwhelmed when I say, but it is incredibly difficult for any public health advancement or any medical advancement to have that much of an effect on life expectancy. The comparison I like to make is to the obesity epidemic. So researchers studying obesity have estimated that if not a single person across the country was obese tomorrow, if we ended the epidemic tomorrow, life expectancy would probably increase by about 3/4 of a year. That's their best estimate, and that's actually the upper bound of their estimate. Okay, so we don't typically think of the crime drop as a public health issue, but for African American men, this is probably the most important advancement in public health of the past several decades. It hasn't just preserved lives; it's made schools safer. Academic performance has increased the most in the places where violence has fallen the most. Racial gaps in achievement have narrowed the most in the places where violence has fallen the most. And families have come back to central city neighborhoods. We find, this is work with a doctoral student named Gerard Torres Espinosa. We have a series of papers, one of which shows that in the cities where violence falls, there's a reduction in the degree to which poverty is concentrated. Okay, so if we get back to the truly disadvantaged, one of the core changes that Professor Wilson documented was the change in the degree to which poverty was concentrated. Okay, so when crime drops, that changes. Okay, higher income families move back into central city neighborhoods. And I know I'll get a question on gentrification. We found no evidence that there's any displacement of poor people in those neighborhoods across the country. Certainly in some cities, that's definitely the case. Boston, that is likely the case that there is displacement. San Francisco, New York, it's certainly the case. But if we look across the country, we have a sample of 300 some odd cities. Across the country, the fall of crime has not led to displacement of the poor. It has led to new populations entering vacancies in neighborhoods that were abandoned. And lastly, it's affected economic mobility. It is, and this happens for multiple reasons. One is that crime and violence affect kids directly. It affects their academic development, their academic achievement. But the second piece that I mentioned earlier is that it undermines entire communities. Okay, so it makes it means that businesses dry up and wither away. It means that public life in the neighborhood starts to die down. Okay, and when that happens, there are fewer opportunities for every kid growing up in that neighborhood. So we found a very strong impact of when violence falls within a city. Kids who grow up in low-income families have a greater chance of moving upward out of poverty when they reach adulthood. So this is, so far, a feel-good story about the fall of violence. And we know that the story is not entirely a feel-good story. Part of the reason, and I have an argument about why violence fell that I'm going to table for now, and maybe we'll get back in the Q&A, but part of the reason, or part of the approach, the dominant approach that we've taken to deal with violent crime in this country, and it's still the dominant approach now, is to rely on the police and the prison system to deal with violence. And that's been the case for the past 50 years. That's been the case since Richard Nixon was elected, and kind of the ideals of the war on poverty started to fade away, and a new rhetoric of law and order kind of took hold, which we've seen resurface in the past year. But that's been the model. That's been the model. Deal with violence and the larger problem of urban poverty through the police and the prison system. And that's brought, just as that's had the greatest impact, just as the crime drop has had the greatest impact on the most disadvantaged segments of the population, the greatest costs have also been experienced by that same segment of the population. So those costs have come in the form of aggressive or violent policing. They've come in the form of intense surveillance and living in the midst of what sometimes in some places feels like a police state or a crime scene. And it's come in the form of mass incarceration. We have almost 7 million Americans who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system, whether they're in jail, prison, parole, or probation. So when we acknowledge that, then we're left with two big questions that frame the book. The first one is, how do we preserve and how do we extend the fall of violence so that it reaches every neighborhood and every city across the country? And I think that's a crucial question at this moment. In the last couple of years, we've seen a spike in violence. It looks like things stabilized in 2017, so that's good news. But that first order question, how do we preserve the crime drop and how do we extend it to the places that haven't experienced it? And then the second piece of it is, how do we do so with a new model? How do we do so with a new model to control violence, to address the larger problem of urban poverty without relying so heavily on the police and the prison? And so I'm not going to go through all my answers to that. That's in the last part of the book where I kind of grapple with those questions. But the basic principle, I'll give you the basic principle behind the policy part of the book, which is that we've made this decision over the past 50 years to respond to the problem of urban violence through punishment. Okay, most of our policies driven by the ideal of punishment. Okay, and what I argue is that we now have sufficient evidence. Okay, so this is not just a moral argument, it's an empirical argument. We now have sufficient evidence to develop a new model, a model that is based on investment. Okay, and in the book, I talk about the types of investments that have the best chance to reduce violence. The core idea is that the groups that have the greatest capacity to control violence are the residents and the organizations in the communities hit hardest by violence. Okay, these are the groups, and this is an empirical statement. Okay, this is not me suggesting that these organizations have some moral authority. This is an empirical statement that these groups, these organizations who work in the communities hit hardest by violence have the greatest capacity to control it, but they've never had the commitment, they've never had the resources to do so. So that's the basic principle, and then I get into much more detail in the book. But I'm going to leave it there because I really want to hear what my mentor, William Julius Wilson, has to say. Thanks.
Now, I just want to take a few minutes to raise a couple of issues and questions, that you might address. As you know, there's been an uptick in violence in the last couple of years in cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore. You mentioned Newark. I didn't think about Newark, but. And what these cities have in common, I want you to think about this. is that they all feature neighborhoods with significant depopulation, okay? And the most, visible symbols of depopulation are abandoned buildings and vacant lots. Anybody who's watched HBO's The Wire know what I'm talking about. David Simon did a brilliant job of capturing this depopulation. And the most fundamental cause of this depopulation were two things. Number one, the cessation of migration from the south to the north in the early 1970s, the end of the Great Migration. Number two, sort of simultaneously, the beginning gradual out-migration of higher income individuals, higher income families that I talked about and you mentioned in the truly disadvantaged. And the point is that in these depopulated neighborhoods, the ranks of these out-migrants were not being replaced with poor migrants flowing in, nor were they being replaced by other racial and ethnic groups, hence the depopulation. And it should be pointed out, and I'm glad that you're here, Gene, because I'd like to get your reaction to this, that whereas cities like Chicago, Baltimore, St. Louis, Milwaukee feature a number of these depopulated neighborhoods, the inner cities in places like Boston and New York tend to be densely populated, okay? Now, you talk about, you say, I really want to know how confident you feel about the argument that gentrification has not significantly led to a displacement of low-income families. But I don't want to talk about it. We're in the discussion. We can argue that point. Okay. Now, if you agree with this analysis, I have two related questions. One is the recent uptick in violence in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Milwaukee, and St. Louis related to problems created by this depopulation. See, these depopulations, depopulation makes it more difficult to sustain basic institutions or to achieve adequate levels of what we call neighborhood social organization.
Detroit in the list?
Huh? Detroit? Yeah, I include Detroit. I mean, I'm just, Detroit definitely included in the list. Now, the second question is the success of community organizations. And this is a major contribution of your book. You talk about the role of community organizations in reducing violence over the past several years. Is the success of community organizers in helping to reduce the violence possibly related to the level of depopulation? In other words, the greater the depopulation, the less likely community organizations will be successful in crime reduction. Again, I think about HBO's The Wire, Thus, my hypothesis, and Gene, I'd like to get your reaction, is that community organizers will be more successful in cities like New York and Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, where inner city neighborhoods tend to be densely populated. I mean, the real challenge for community organizers is to work in these neighborhoods that have undergone significant depopulation. Now, also, you know, speaking of these densely populated poor neighborhoods, including poor, largely black neighborhoods, in cities like New York and Boston, a study, and I'll just end here, a study by Dan Zubri reveals that these cities feature a growing number of higher paying jobs in creative industries and other growing sectors, research, finance. Look, I live here in Cambridge and the property values have gone up. The assessment of my condo is going through the roof. And what's happening as these industries are relocating to places like Boston, they're attracting a growing number of young professionals who faced with increases in the costs of housing, rentals in these cities, are ready to relocate to inner city neighborhoods in places like Boston, where redevelopment projects are underway. And this is one of the factors driving gentrification in these cities like New York and Boston. And gentrification is one of the things that you talked about. I just want to get, well, never mind, I'm finished.
On Bill's observation, the Boston case is absolutely fascinating because, number one, 25 years ago, in the Four Corners neighborhood, Omar McRoberts did some of his research there, right? 44% of the homicides in the city were committed by 11% of the population. And Four Corners was East Baltimore. There were literally Omar, I mean, every character of the series was residing. And the thing that we saw in the organizing was that, as Bill has indicated, we saw the gentrification. As soon as it began to dip, and this was sort of the way we measured it. We're doing the organizing, and I remember, this was 15 years ago, a young white woman with a tricycle with the baby and the Starbucks coffee ran through Washington Street through Four Corners. And a group of us stood on the corner and said, there goes the neighborhood. There it is, right? And I think that Bill is correct, especially in the Boston case. Yeah. The real estate market in Dorchester is on fire. And so you take one of the toughest areas, they're asking $700,000 for a tiny house, you know, in a section that the majority of people in this room would never be found. And so I think, for me, you know, I've got some agency questions based on your analysis in your first book about your ideas, because Bill, in the Boston case, it's absolutely true. In the Baltimore case, you're not going to be replacing, you know, white folk ain't moving into East Baltimore. I mean, that's just not happening. What, 400 homicides last year, something like that? Right. And then you get the level of corruption, because in the Chicago case and Baltimore, we would not be able to accomplish what was accomplished in Baltimore if we had the levels of corruption in the police departments. Was it 2 months ago, one cop murdered another cop who was supposed to testify the following day, or so some such situation. So I think Bill is onto a very important point. You go to Detroit, you go to Baltimore, you go to parts of Indiana, Indianapolis. You don't see the gentrification, and Boston's on fire. I mean, our understanding is that Boston is morphing into a boutique city, right? Because in the poorest neighborhoods, Northeastern University is moving to Grove Hall, right? So it's pretty much over, and most of the black population is being moved to Brockton, New Bedford, and it's almost the Parisianization of Boston, where you're just going to put the blacks in the outer rim, exurbs, and it'll essentially be, I mean, this Boston Globe did the series a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, Boston morphs into a white upper middle class city, pretty much.
Actually, let me clarify the gentrification piece, because that always makes people annoyed and pissed off. I gotta be more clear about exactly what we found. So what we did is we looked across the country, and this is 364 plus around there cities with 100,000 or more people, and it might have even been 50,000 plus. Anyway, we developed a model to identify the causal impact. So all of this is, we're going to argue that it's causal, okay? Violent crime caused this to happen. This is not just an association between violent crime and population shifts. And I can talk about why I think that if anybody cares. But what we found is that across the country, in all of these cities, places where that had a drop in crime had a reduction in the segregation of the poor from the rest of the city, meaning neighborhoods where the poor were concentrated became less severely poor, okay? So high poverty neighborhoods became more mixed, attracted better educated people, attracted people with higher income, okay? Didn't necessarily become racially and ethnically integrated, but became more economically integrated, okay? And so the idea is that as crime falls, new populations are entering into a neighborhood, willing to go into neighborhoods that they weren't willing to go into previously. Across the country, so let's get out of the Boston, DC, New York, San Francisco mindset. Across the country, many of these neighborhoods where poverty is concentrated have extremely high vacancy rates. They have depopulated, okay? They have housing available. The influx of higher income people into these neighborhoods did not lead to rapid increases in rents, did not lead to, when someone moves in, it didn't mean that someone was pushed out. So there's no relationship to the number of poor people in these neighborhoods. It's just new populations entering. This model does not apply to cities with hot real estate markets. It doesn't apply to Boston. It doesn't apply to San Francisco, New York, DC, even Chicago. So I have to kind of make the national argument. Then we have to make the argument about what you do in these cities that do have hot markets. And here, I think we have a very clear set of ideas about policies that you can use to preserve housing outside of the market, to make sure there's affordable housing as a neighborhood changes, to make sure those residents who were there from the start can stay there. And that's very politically very difficult, but people have done it. Neighborhoods have done it. And organizations have had that strategy. Before this place turns over, how can we get some housing out of the market so that these people can stay here? The last point I'll make is, 25 years ago, the problem was nobody wanted to go to Dorchester. Nobody wanted to step foot in Four Corners. And that was true in cities all over the country. A lot of cities were war zones. There was no demand, and this is why the problem of concentrated poverty came with this depopulation. Nobody wanted to live there. There's no demand. Now we have this different problem of too much demand. Everybody wants to live there. People see that it's a good investment opportunity. People see that property values are rising. People see that there are businesses opening up shop in places, again, that were dead 20 years ago. So this brings with it its own set of problems. It brings with it not just displacement and rising rents, but it brings with it political displacement. It brings with it cultural displacement when the character of a community changes and the people who have lived there forever suddenly find themselves feeling not at home. And these are very serious issues, but I just want to make the case that they are much better issues to have than the issues that we had 25 years ago.
I don't think we should continue talking. We could go on and on. But maybe there are questions from the audience.
Okay, well, you said that people moved out of Boston to New Bedford and other towns like that. Does this bring the problem that used to be here over to those cities, or did these people somehow rise into the middle class?
Displacement. And again, Pat, we have to have the discussion about the extent to which gentrification has led to displacement. When I look at Washington, D.C., I spent a year in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress, and I got to know a lot of the blacks who worked at the Library of Congress, and they were complaining about having to move out of their neighborhoods. You know, they couldn't afford it anymore. Taxes have increased, and rentals have increased, and the cost of rentals and housing have significantly increased, and so on. But that's beside the point. The thing is that the relocation of these families from certain inner city neighborhoods in a number of cities have led to an increase in concentrated poverty in the inner ring suburbs. Okay? There has been a substantial increase in concentrated poverty in the suburbs, and I maintain, Pat, that part of that, what has contributed to the increase in concentrated poverty in inner ring suburbs, has been displacement from gentrification in some of these areas. But we can have that. Well, I don't want to argue with you. I mean, after all, this is, okay, go ahead.
Just to speak to the gentleman's question. In the case of Dorchester Lower Roxbury, all of the HUD housing is now being sold so that they can turn the housing into market rate stuff. And the consensus, you go into the average barbershop, the guy tells you, look, they're taking all the HUD housing, New Bedford, high levels of poverty, concentration, a crime problem that's ticking up, New Bedford. And so there's the general understanding among rank and file black people, we're being pushed out in addition to the universities. So, for example, Northeastern University is now moving into Dudley, up Warren Street to Grove Hall. And Grove Hall was like used to be downtown like Roxbury, the Hood. That's all gone. So Bill's point, at least in the case of Boston, because the real estate market's on fire, a lot of the HUD money, the HUD housing, is being gobbled up by private developers. And what's interesting in Dudley Station, it's Chinese and Russians.
Thank you. Is your research only about crime in the city, or does it also, I mean, we've spent some time talking about gentrification. We won't, because that takes away from your thesis, and we should focus on your thesis a little bit here.
Does anyone have a non-gentrification question?
That's why I'm. This is the non-gentrification question. So the idea is then has the crime and moved away? So that's something. So the thing is, I want to make sure we that are you saying crime is overall gone down? Which is
Crime
what
has fallen everywhere.
Right.
It's
Okay.
fallen
Well,
in
great.
central cities,
So good.
suburbs,
Great.
rural areas, everywhere.
So good. Then you've solved that problem for me. So then let's talk about this book that was written called Freakonomics. I mean, so I'm puzzled by. I mean, we can't. The only explanation cannot be the 1, 2, 3 strikes you're out. Bill Clinton idea of put everybody in jail. That can't be the only reason, because people are still. So Freakonomics talks about how the Roe v. Wade, if you remember right, that was a seminal law that therefore reduced illegitimate pregnancies, and therefore that's one theory. I'd love for you to provide. Your thesis looks great. Tell us, why is the crime gone down overall then? I mean, it can't be just explained. Forget this Boston rich people problem. Yeah. No, forget, that's not the problem. I would love to hear your thesis. Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
That's a major contribution of the book, by the way.
Thanks. Thank you. I appreciate that. So what I argue is that something happened in the early 1990s, and let me start here. That was the first time that the violent crime came to be seen as a national crisis. People always care about violence, but so the Gallup poll asked, what's the most pressing issue facing the United States? They've asked that question every year since 1930. In 1994, for the first time in the history of that poll, violent crime was the top answer. And and it reflected the larger climate. For the first time, politicians from Democratic Party and the Republican Party were battling to see who could be tougher on crime. The whole country was focused on this. Clinton ran on it. So the starting point for the answer is that this was a period where violent crime was recognized as a national crisis, and the entire country mobilized to deal with it. Now, what form did that take? First, it took the form of more police on the street. Okay, so the 1994 crime bill put probably 60,000 new officers on the street. More police on the street leads to less crime. A lot of people don't like that relationship. It is true, okay? We have really good evidence on it. It is true. Open-air drug markets were shut down in cities across the country. Open-air drug markets for crack created a tremendous amount of violence. At the same time, the incarceration rate continued to go up. There's lots more debate about whether that had an impact, and if it had an impact, how much of an impact. But I just want to note that this involved crackdowns on gang activity in addition to major crackdowns on open-air drug dealing. Private security forces expanded on a grand scale. So if you look at the private security guard industry, it exploded in the 1990s. This wasn't just a public thing. This was a private thing. Entire cities started installing camera systems. Schools started installing camera systems, metal detectors. The whole country became obsessed with violent crime in the early 1990s. There's another dimension of it that doesn't come up. So people have pointed to all of that stuff. What people have not pointed to is what happened when the 10-point coalition came together. What happened in the neighborhoods hit hardest by violence. There was a national mobilization against violence that took place among the residents organized into the community-based organizations in the neighborhoods where violence was the most severe problem. And you know, we hear inspiring stories about individual organizations and the work that they've done, but those stories are dismissed or ignored when people talk about why violence fell. And I think part of the reason is that, you know, you can't replicate Gene Rivers, you know, you can't replicate the people who did this, the people who came together and did this. So it doesn't seem like the basis for public policy. But when you look at what actually happened, the nonprofit sector was starved in the 1980s by Reagan, okay? It exploded, it proliferated in the 1990s. These organizations emerged in the thousands all over the country to build stronger neighborhoods, to confront violence. So what we do in the book is we set up a causal analysis to see how much of an impact the expansion of community organizations devoted to fighting violence had. And it was a major part of what happened. It's not the entire story, but so my answer to your question is that urban space transformed in the 1990s, and it transformed because of more police, more private security guards, more technology focused on surveillance, and a mobilization among community organizations. So it's not entirely positive, it's not entirely negative, but the collection of activities transformed urban space, and I think that is by far the most plausible explanation for why violence fell at that moment.
I have a couple questions. There was a report on NPR just a few years ago, or a couple years ago, about how in like the most dangerous cities or the poorest parts of the most poorest areas of Chicago, that kids had to join gangs just to feel protected or belonging, or just there was almost a difficulty in pushing back against it. And I wondered if that was still the case, and that was one thing. And then the other thing, I don't know if this is changing the subject, but I got a psychology degree both at NYU and Harvard, and then last year, just for a half year, I went out to Silicon Valley to do some work in the school system. So I was wondering about, there's an incredible amount of violence in terms of suicide out there. It's sort of like maybe both ends are like the violence with kids in Palo Alto. There was this huge rash of suicides just jumping up onto the train tracks, on the train tracks, and it got so bad that parents started monitoring the train tracks. And I just wondered, the numbers never came out in the press, but it was like 17 kids. And I just wonder if there's that kind of violence at the other end.
Yeah. Tough questions. So I'm going to do you want to talk about Chicago? Bill knows Chicago much better than me.
Yeah, I think a lot of kids still feel compelled to join gangs in certain neighborhoods of Chicago, particularly those neighborhoods that have experienced a sudden increase in violence. All of a sudden, I'm blocking on the name of neighborhoods in Chicago. That's what happens when you wake up in the middle of the night. You don't fall back to sleep. Never mind. But yeah, so you're right. It's still, I haven't done any recent research in Chicago, but I would be very surprised to learn that kids no longer feel compelled to join gangs for their own self-protection in some of these neighborhoods.
It's a fairly standard thing. You're a little kid, there's nobody to protect you literally. I got drafted into street gang when I was 12. And it was as simple as, dude, you're going to do one of two things. We're going to try to drown you in the boys' room toilet, or you're going to join the gang. And those were the options. And for a lot of kids, and the very violent, it's, at one level, it's not physics. I need to, how am I going to make it from school? Yes. The short answer to your question is yes. It's just very tough. You're an 11-year-old kid, they're the bullies, and you're going to get conscripted, or you're going to just get abused every day. I mean, Bill's talked about this, because one of the things that's really significant is the good kid, right, who was generally ignored in the literature. The West Indian kid whose mom works 4 jobs, he's doing everything he can to resist. And in the literature, unfortunately, that kid gets ignored. Yes, kids are getting drafted into gangs. I mean, as Bill said before, The Wire, which is probably the best, the best thing that's been done artistically on the phenomena.
But I would also say that in neighborhoods where there is that strong organizational base, where kids have a place to go, then it's very different. We talked, when you were talking before about depopulated neighborhoods, and I went to Milwaukee last year and took a tour of the city, and part of the tour was each block we went down, I would kind of say, oh, so what organizations are here, or who's here, who runs the show here, and in a lot of places there is that organization. Actually, there's one great example. I jotted a note to say this. We went down this block, and there were boarded up houses up and down the block, and Milwaukee has this huge vacancy problem, and then at the corner there was this one house, and the windows were boarded up, but they were painted. So they were painted in these bright colors with shutters painted on the windows, on the plywood. And so I'm taking this tour, and I say, I observed this house, and then I went into this center, the Dominican Center, run by a Sister Patricia Rogers, and I started talking to her, and I asked her about that house, and she said, oh, I had a couple of my guys paint that. And I said, how come? And she said, well, I want people to know that I'm looking out for it. It's empty, but I'm looking out for it. And so that's kind of like the ideal. If you have somebody who's looking out for every kid in that neighborhood, then you're not on your own when you make that choice about which way you're going to go. If you have a boys club, if you have a community center that's safe, if you have after-school programs, then that choice is not the only choice you have.
I can just say, this is the major contribution of your book, Pat. That is, you talk about the mobilization of community-based organizations to combat violence. I mean, that's something that we haven't thought about. This is a new idea. It's very important, and that's what I was trying to build on that book, to say that The challenge is greater in the depopulated neighborhoods, but nonetheless, the mobilization of community-based organizations is a issue that we should be looking at as sociologists.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that. I'm assuming that when we're talking about community-based organizations, that there's a lot of different kinds of community-based organizations. Do you talk at all in your book about the specific kinds of community-based organizations or the types of work that certain organizations are doing that seems preferable, that you're seeing is having a bigger impact?
He always has to ask me the tough question. He's still mad that he's never won a game of one-on-one basketball against me. No, it's an important question. So, I mean, what I refer to in the book, I refer to the idea of a community quarterback. And a community quarterback is any organization that takes responsibility for the entire neighborhood. And so that has come in the form of a church, that can come in the form of a community center, it can come in the form of a substance abuse treatment center. It can come in the form of a hospital if the hospital has an outward-facing approach. And so I think there are models out there. I always point to purpose-built communities because they built these organizations and they kind of have this idea. They came up with that term, community quarterback, and they've in Eastlake, Atlanta, they built an organization that, with some controversy, has completely transformed the neighborhood. And so I point to that as like the model, but it can come in any form as long as the organization takes responsibility, not just for the people who come through the doors, but for every person in every public space in that neighborhood. Thank you all for coming. I'm very grateful.
Thanks, everybody.
So I'm checking my pockets of the coat, and I discovered that I have a copy of the Constitution in my pocket. So I tell Ghazala, this is conversation taking place in the elevator, that I have this copy. Can I pull it out? And she again, rightly, she had been editor of my life, correcting. She said to me, no, you cannot do this unless you take permission from them. But let's sit down in the cab and let's practice. How would you, if they give you permission, how would you pull it out? I said, I'll pull it out like this. She said, look, this doesn't say anything. So now we are in the cab and I am doing this. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. And the cab driver, I can tell, is looking at us and laughing and smiling and saying,